Some heroes don't wear medals, they leave behind moments that no one else remembers. Harrison Ford had long forgotten the rescue. One boy, one storm, one flight. It was just another mission in a lifetime full of them. But 27 years later, a voice echoed through a studio and into his soul. "You didn't ask my name," it said, "but you gave me a future." And that was enough to awaken a memory buried beneath dust, silence, and history. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. In an unexpected and deeply emotional moment, Hollywood legend Harrison Ford was seen blinking hard under the studio lights during what was supposed to be a celebratory late-night interview. It was the 50th anniversary of his acting career, and the crowd had come alive with cheers as he stepped onto the stage, smiling, calm, almost reluctant about the spotlight as always. The host cracked jokes, played clips from Ford's most iconic roles, from Indiana Jones to Air Force One. The audience roared with laughter and applause, but behind Harrison's warm grin was a quiet flicker, like something inside him wasn't fully present. About halfway through the show, the host leaned in with a glint in his eye and said, "We've got a little surprise for you tonight, Mr. Ford. A live call from far away." Ford blinked slowly, still smiling, a little puzzled. What kind of surprise? The lights dimmed slightly. The giant screen behind the host flickered to life, first black, then a flag appeared, red, green, and gold. A murmuring began to ripple through the audience. "Burkina Faso," someone whispered. Then a voice, calm and gentle but unmistakably composed, came through the speakers. "Good evening, Mr. Ford." The screen now showed a man in a formal jacket, standing still, dignified. His accent was French-tinted but his English clear. "This is Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso." The room froze. For the first time in the show's history, nothing moved, not a breath, not a word, not a single hand clapped. Ford's expression shifted. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward just slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the chair. "Mr. Ford," the president continued, "you do not know me. But nearly 3 decades ago, in the mountains of southern Burkina Faso, I was just a boy, wounded, afraid, barely conscious. You were flying a rescue helicopter." Ford's eyes narrowed slowly. His hand tightened just a bit on the chair's armrest. "I remember the sky was red with dust. I remember your voice calm. I remember being lifted, carried. And I remember thinking, this must be what angels look like." The audience didn't make a sound. One person brought a hand to their mouth. "You didn't ask my name, Mr. Ford. You didn't wait for cameras. You just came down into a storm and pulled me out." Harrison's eyes were beginning to shine, not from ego, not from pride, but something deeper, like a door inside him, long sealed, had begun to open again. President Traoré went on, "You didn't know that the boy you saved would one day become the man speaking to you now. But that day changed everything. I recovered, I studied. And every time I wanted to quit, I remembered the man who didn't." A long pause. Ford now looked as though he wasn't on stage anymore, but back there, in the dust, in the heat, with the whir of blades and a child in his arms. "Tonight," the president said, "I speak not just as a leader, but as that same boy. And I want to say, in front of your nation and mine, thank you for giving me a future." Ford's hand trembled. His voice cracked as he said, softly, almost a whisper, I didn't know you made it." "You did more than save a life," Traoré said. "You planted something in me that I carried all my life. And tonight, I just wanted you to know it grew." There was a hush, deep and sacred. No applause, no movement. Only a man remembering a moment he never thought would return, only to discover it never left. The line was still open, the studio still silent. Harrison Ford sat unmoving, his eyes fixed on the screen like he was watching something only he could see. On the other end, President Ibrahim Traoré continued, his voice steady, but soft enough to make everyone lean in just to hear. "I was 9 years old," he said. "It was the dry season. The air was thick with dust, and the sun was burning through every leaf in the valley. That day, rebels had moved into our region. My village was caught in the crossfire. I remember running. I remember falling." His tone didn't waver, but his eyes carried the weight of someone walking back through fire. They shot at anything that moved, I don't know how long I lay there. My leg was bleeding. My grandmother had wrapped me in her shawl and whispered to God. Then, somewhere above us, came a sound I had never heard before, the low beat of rotor blades, growing louder, closer. A helicopter. Traoré paused. In the studio, a woman wiped her eyes. The host sat completely still. You landed just outside the village. The wind from your blades kicked up the dust until we couldn't see. Then I saw boots, then knees, then a man with silver hair. He didn't speak, he didn't hesitate. He picked me up like I weighed nothing. Ford leaned forward slightly, eyes unblinking. You didn't ask who I was. You didn't ask where my parents were. You didn't even ask if I was worth saving. You just looked at me like I mattered. A single tear ran down the president's cheek. I don't remember my mother's face that day. I don't remember what she said when I left. But I remember your hands. They were strong but gentle. Covered in dust. I remember how you looked at me in the helicopter just once and nodded, as if to say you'll be all right. Harrison closed his eyes, briefly, like the weight of that sentence had pulled something old and buried to the surface. I spent weeks recovering in a small clinic, Traoré went on. No one ever told me your name. They just said, the American pilot. For years I tried to find out who you were, but I was just a boy. All I had was a memory. A feeling, but that feeling became something else. He paused again. It became direction. Every exam I took, every time I stood up to someone bigger than me, every moment I felt fear, I remembered the man who stepped into a storm for a boy he didn't know. In the audience, a young man in the back wiped his nose and whispered to the person beside him, "That's not just a story, that's a life." President Traoré lowered his gaze for a moment, then lifted it again. When I became a soldier, I kept asking myself, what kind of leader risks his life for someone without expecting anything in return? And every time I saw you, Ford's lips parted slightly, like he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. You didn't just carry me that day, Mr. Ford. You carried a future, one that now carries others. And then, after a long breath, thank you, not for saving me, but for showing me how to be a man who would never leave a child behind. The studio remained in stillness. Harrison's fingers slowly curled into a fist on his knee. His eyes shimmered, but no tears fell yet, because this wasn't the end of a memory. It was only the beginning. The show ended, but the silence followed him home. Harrison Ford sat alone in his study that night, long after the applause had faded and the city outside had gone to sleep. The room was warm with amber light. Bookshelves lined the walls. A single lamp cast a circle over the old wooden desk. On it sat a small metal box, dented, scratched, and untouched for years. He opened it. Inside, a handful of objects, an old compass, a pilot's badge, a folded flight map stained at the corners, and near the bottom, wrapped in an aging cloth, was the flight logbook from 1998. He lifted it carefully, almost reverently, and turned the pages with slow fingers. Flight 241, coordinates south of Nauri, rescue op, dust storm, 3 civilians, 1 male child, critical, transferred to local field medic, prognosis, unknown, hopeful. He stared at those last 2 words. Hopeful. It was written in his own handwriting, but he had no memory of writing it, no memory of anything after that moment, just the blur of rotors, blood, sweat, and adrenaline. He had logged the rescue like any other, folded it away. Moved on until now. Ford leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes. His mind didn't return to the show or the president or even the words spoken. It went to that boy, the weight of him in his arms, the silence. The way his small hand had clutched the strap on Ford's vest. He got up slowly and walked to the far corner of the study, opened a low drawer. There, wrapped in faded canvas, was something he hadn't touched in years. A twisted piece of helicopter rotor blade, about a foot long, bent, charred at the edges. He'd found it embedded in the dirt after that mission. No reason to keep it, no logic. But something had made him reach down, pick it up, and take it home. He told himself it was a reminder of the risk, of the storm, but now, for the first time, he wondered if it had been more. He held it gently, the cold metal resting in his palms like a relic. His breath was steady, his eyes no longer wet but deeper somehow, changed. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. At 2:13 a.m., Harrison Ford opened his laptop, booked a one-way flight to Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, departure in 9 hours, no assistant, no agent, no camera crew. He packed a single bag. Inside, he placed the flight log, the bent rotor piece, and a photograph from the rescue archives, a blurry shot of a dust-covered chopper hovering just above the ground, its doors open, its purpose clear. As the sky began to lighten over Los Angeles, he stood at his window and whispered to no one in particular, "I have to go." In another part of the world, far beyond oceans and headlines, a young boy was waking up for school, unaware that the man who once saved a life and unknowingly shaped a nation was already in the air, coming back. Not as a star, but as a man answering something deeper than memory. A call. The sun was low when the black SUV pulled onto a narrow dirt road, winding past rust-colored hills and fields of dry grass swaying gently in the wind. Children waved as the car passed, barefoot and smiling, unaware of the history riding quietly inside. Harrison Ford sat in the back seat, silent. He hadn't spoken much since landing. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words felt too small. The vehicle stopped near a modest clay house, its walls sun-baked and patched with age. A woven curtain stirred in the doorway. There were no guards, no cameras, no red carpet, just stillness. President Traoré stepped out first, motioning gently toward the house. "She's inside," he said softly. Ford nodded once. He walked slowly, his boots stirring dust with each step. As he reached the threshold, he removed his hat instinctively, like he was entering a sacred place. Inside, the air was cool and quiet. A single window let in a thin ribbon of light. On a low cot, draped in a thin sheet, lay an elderly woman. Her hair was white, braided tightly. Her hands were folded, weathered with time. Her eyes opened slowly when she heard him. He froze. She looked at him with a gaze that seemed to stretch across decades. "So it's really you," she whispered in French-accented English. "The pilot." Ford stepped closer, heart pounding, unsure what to say. "I watched you descend from the sky," she said. "You came like thunder, and then there was peace." She motioned slowly to a small tin box beside the bed. Her hand trembled as she opened it and pulled out a folded, yellowed envelope. The edges were worn soft by time. She handed it to him. "I wrote this the night after you left," she said, "but I never sent it. No one believed me. They said I imagined it, that no American would fly into a rebel zone for a child." Ford unfolded the letter gently. It was addressed to the United States Embassy, dated 27 years ago. In careful cursive, it read, "To the kind pilot who saved my grandson and vanished without a name, I saw you, I thank you. May your country know what kind of men wear its wings." His hands shook slightly as he held it. The room was silent. "You believed in something no one else saw," he said quietly. "I believed in what I saw with my own eyes," she replied. "A man who didn't flinch when others ran. A man who didn't wait for permission to do what was right." He looked at her then, truly looked. Not as a visitor, not as a celebrity, but as someone being reminded of a truth he hadn't carried in a long time. "You kept this," he said. "All these years," she nodded. "In my pocket, every day." It reminded me that somewhere in the world, goodness still flew. Ford's throat tightened. "Thank you for not forgetting," he said. She smiled faintly. "I didn't remember your name," she whispered, "but I remembered your hands." The same words the president had used, and suddenly everything aligned. Memory, belief, witness. She had waited nearly 3 decades to give this letter to a man she was told did not exist. And now he was standing beside her bed, the letter in his hands, the boy she raised now leading a nation. Sometimes faith doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to endure. Ford gently placed the letter back into the box, and without thinking, he reached into his bag and took out the bent piece of rotor blade. "This was with me that day," he said. "I didn't know why I kept it. Now I do." She looked at it. Her eyes softened. "Then keep it," she said. "Let it remind you of who you are." He nodded quietly. They didn't say much after that, because they didn't need to. 2 people, 2 memories, 1 truth. The morning sun cast a soft gold over the hills of Nauri as the SUV rumbled to a stop on a patch of dry, open land. No signs marked the place. No plaques, no fences, just earth, wind, and silence. But for two men, it was sacred ground. "This is where it happened," said President Traoré, stepping out and letting the wind brush against his face. The rescue, the moment everything changed. Harrison Ford followed him, his boots sinking lightly into the dust. He looked around. The field was larger than he remembered, the trees more sparse, but something in the air still carried weight. Memory has a way of holding its shape, even after the world forgets. They walked together in silence. A few local children played nearby, kicking a plastic ball, their laughter light and distant. Behind them, a small team of builders was surveying the area, quietly laying markers for what was to come. "We want to build a school here," Ibrahim said, "for the children of this region. Many walk hours to reach the nearest classroom. I've already spoken to the ministry. It's being fast-tracked." Ford nodded slowly. "And we want to name it after you." He turned his head. "After me? Of course," Ibrahim said. "You saved a life here. You shaped a path. This school is your legacy." Ford looked down at the ground. His eyes followed the dust swirling gently at his feet. Then he looked up at the children, one of whom had stopped playing to watch the two men. The boy was barefoot, holding the ball against his chest, curiosity written across his face. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the bent piece of rotor blade. It had been with him every step of this journey. A strange artifact, meaningless to others, but to him it was everything. He knelt before the boy and held it out. "Take this," he said softly. "It once helped lift someone who needed saving. Maybe now it will help lift more." The boy reached for it, slowly, eyes wide. His small fingers closed around the cold metal. "Let it fly again," Ford whispered. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing something bigger than himself. Then Ford stood and turned to Ibrahim. "Don't name the school after me," he said. The president looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because I didn't carry that memory all these years," Ford replied. "She did, your grandmother. She remembered when no one else did. She believed even when people told her not to. That kind of faith deserves to be written in stone." Ibrahim was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "You're right. She kept the story alive," Ford said. "I only came back to finish it." A wind picked up, lifting dust across the field. In the distance, the children laughed again. The boy now held the rotor piece like a treasure, and so it was decided. No banners would fly with Harrison's name, no signature carved into marble. But a school would rise, right here, on the land where a child was saved, and a nation's story quietly began. It would bear the name of a woman who waited almost 30 years to be heard. Because some legacies are not in what you do for the world, they are in what you choose to remember. The night was still. The stars outside blinked against the vast black sky, and the wind moved softly through the thatched roof like a lullaby only the earth could hum. Inside the small clay house, the air was thick with quiet. Time had slowed, not out of sadness, but out of reverence. She was lying on her side now, her back gently propped by folded blankets. Her breathing had become shallow, like waves pulling farther and farther away from the shore. Maman Hawa, grandmother to a president, witness to a rescue, keeper of a memory no one believed, until now. Harrison sat beside her, his chair pulled close. Ibrahim stood on the other side, his hand resting lightly on hers. The three of them had not spoken much that evening. The silence felt fuller than words could ever be. Her eyes fluttered open. "You're still here," she whispered, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Of course," Ibrahim said gently. "Always." She looked toward Ford. Her voice was barely audible but clear. "And you came back." He nodded once, eyes damp but steady. "I needed to," he said. She looked up at the ceiling for a moment, as if remembering something from far away. "I used to watch the sky at night," she said. "I used to tell Ibrahim, one day you'll fly, one day you'll lead." She turned her head slightly, and her eyes found the president's. "You remember the game, don't you?" He smiled through his tears. "I do." She lifted her hand with effort, motioning toward a small woven basket beside the bed. "Bring it." He did. Inside, wrapped in fabric older than either man could date, was a piece of red cloth. Worn, frayed, a child's scarf. "He used to tie this around my arm," she said, laughing softly. "He said I was his general, and he was the president." Ibrahim held it delicately, as if it might fall apart from memory alone. Ford watched him, watched the scarf. watched the way Ibrahim's hands trembled slightly. She turned back to Ford. "There is something I must ask of both of you." Her tone changed, not heavy but rooted. Final, "Don't let any child here learn on an empty stomach." She looked at Ibrahim. "You lead now, but lead with your belly full of humility, and your pockets full of nothing, so your hands stay open." Then she looked at Ford. "You tell stories. Tell this one, not for me, but for the next woman whose story isn't believed, whose memory holds up a man, a country." A silence followed, deep and sacred. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them one last time. "Take care of each other," she whispered. And just like that, the breath left her body. No gasp, no fear, only stillness. Ibrahim lowered his head, Ford bowed his. They sat there for a long time, the scarf resting between them like a thread stitched from one generation to the next. "She gave everything," Ibrahim said finally. "When she had nothing, now we must give everything back." Ford reached forward, touching the scarf. "We will," he said quietly. Outside, the wind shifted. It carried the scent of wood smoke and shea butter and something older than memory. A dog barked once, far off. Then silence again. In that small room, in the middle of the night, history had turned its page. A leader had been shaped not by politics, not by war, but by a woman who tied a scarf around her arm and believed her grandson could change the world. Now that scarf would fly again, but not in the wind, in the hands of men who remembered. The sun rose slow and gentle over the hills of Nauri, brushing the land with light as if it too remembered. A soft breeze carried the smell of clay and ashwood across the open field. 1 month had passed since she left them. 1 month since the scarf had changed hands. And now something stood where once there had only been dust and memory. A statue, no guards, no fanfare, no unveiling ceremony, just a small gathering of villagers, teachers, elders, and children in bare feet, and 2 men standing side by side, one who once flew above this land and one who now led it. The statue wasn't grand, it wasn't tall, it didn't gleam, it was carved from local stone, uneven and warm in color, and it showed only this: a single outstretched arm, carved in motion, lifting a child from the ground. No face. No rank, no wings on the sleeve, no medals, just a moment frozen in time, a gesture, a choice. At its base, a line etched into the stone read, "He did not ask my name, but he taught me how to carry it." Harrison stood looking at it, his hands in his pockets. Ibrahim stood beside him, holding a small candle that flickered in the wind. No one spoke for a long time. The silence didn't need explanation. Someone in the crowd began humming. A tune with no lyrics, a tune that felt like roots being watered. A young girl stepped forward, holding a drawing she had made of the scarf. She handed it to Ford. He took it slowly, nodding his thanks without words. Later that evening, a video surfaced online. Just 20 seconds, no dialogue, just a shaky clip of Harrison Ford standing in front of the statue, eyes red, the candlelight flickering against his face. Behind him, Ibrahim laid the folded scarf gently on the stone base. That was all, but it spread like fire. Within hours, it was everywhere. The pilot came back. The boy became a president. The grandmother kept the truth alive. No branding. No sponsor, just truth. Then Harrison posted a photo on his own account, a wide shot of the statue at sunrise. The caption read, "I didn't save a boy, I borrowed a future." The world paused. Comments poured in from every time zone. "My grandmother kept my father alive during the war. She never talked about it. I think I finally understand why. This made me cry, but not the loud kind. The kind where you sit in your car for 10 minutes before driving home." One woman from Peru wrote, "My son asked me who that man was. I told him, someone who remembered what mattered." But the most powerful comment came from a 13-year-old in Kenya. "One day, I want to be someone's scarf." No one explained it. No one had to, because some stories don't need exposition. They just need to be felt. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving at the school site. From all over the world, folded drawings, coins, books, scarves. Notes written by children, by mothers, by strangers, all addressed to the school with no name. The one named not for a man who saved, but for the woman who remembered. Construction began quietly. The foundation was laid in silence. And at night, if you stood close enough to the statue, You could hear the wind moving through the trees like breath, like a voice too old for language. They say legacy is what you leave behind, but sometimes it's what you return to. And sometimes it's what returns to you. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.